Okay, issue 3, the Holocaust. Jim, do you see this week's memorializations in Israel, the 75th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz, as perhaps a unifying moment? I mean, President Putin was there, Vice President Pence was there. History reminds us that there are great distinctions in political ideologies, but in that case at least, there was an alliance that ended something very terrible.
Yes, and it was a moral atrocity that united people in opposition to it across ideological lines during 75 years ago, and I think we remember it today, but we do remember it in the backdrop of a lot of concern about rising anti-Semitism throughout the world, including in the United States, violence against Jewish people, a lot of high-profile cases in recent months. But overall, I think among the international community is certainly a real source of unity.
Eleanor, any thoughts?
Well, there was some controversy over the way some of these leaders handled the occasion. Vice President Pence and Israel's Prime Minister Netanyahu used it as an occasion to single out Iran and to basically, I don't know, accuse Iran of, kind of secretly plotting another Holocaust in the way that they're treating some of their foreign adversaries, which is way over the top. And the French President Macron called them out on this and said this shouldn't be an occasion to use it as a cover to accuse another nation of conducting this kind of, nothing is on a par with the Holocaust. Mm-hmm. Comparing it should not be done. And I commend Macron for basically calling out these. That was not the occasion to do that.
And Ellen makes the case, perhaps not the occasion, but Iran has repeatedly said it wants to wipe Israel off the map.
And I think Iran is Israel's probably greatest concern in the region, I would argue, and I would think most foreign policy experts would agree with that. But look, I think the moment in its entirety was a great lesson for the world, and I think history is life's greatest teacher. And as Jim pointed out, you're seeing this rise of anti-Semitism in the United States. My hope is that by bringing together leaders who have disparate ideological views, some countries that are even adversarial in nature, would be able to teach people in their own countries how important it is so that we don't have a repeat of what we saw 75 years ago.
Yeah, I am quite disturbed. I'm very sorry to be so disturbed about the trending of opinion among young folks. My son's generation and the college age kids these days, too many of them see anti-Semitism as something that is distant from them, they don't see it in some of the criticism of Israel that's going around these days, in which Israel itself is being cast as a new imperialist monster, because they're confusing the domestic politics of the country with the ethnic group on the whole, and the globe. These are the kind of things we cannot take for granted. Our kids are going to pick this up any more than we can take for granted they're going to have intelligent sex education without some guidance. And this is the kind of a reason why I care more about these Holocaust observations now than I used to.
Very well
You have to look at it in the context of countries wanting war with Iran, and Israel would be one. I would say there's an element in this country who would like a military confrontation and want more confrontation as well. And once you start getting into motivations, I mean, Iran does a lot of bad things, but suggesting that they're trying to mount something on the scale of a Holocaust, again, I think that's propaganda from.
But
they
the
say
the propaganda comes from Iran. I mean, words do sometimes ultimately lead to action, Eleanor, and I don't think that we should not take those words at some level of seriousness.
The irony is, in the past, Iran was a haven for Jews in the past.
They actually do have a Jewish population. It's much more complicated than
I'm not reducing
than the overall rhetoric. And I would say about anti-Semitism, it's a dark force that's been with us for a long time, and we look to our leaders to treat it in a way that condemns it and not quietly encourages it. And I'm not naming names there, but you can figure out who I'm talking about.
one of the, and I'll come to you, one of the fascinating things about anti-Semitism is the degree to which in history, right, with the pogroms going back, the roots of it are, in a base envy for a culture that is built around hard work, strong family, really positive virtues in Judaism. Right. And, you look back in Europe especially, one of the things of the history is just kind of losers who are blaming people for being more successful than they were. I mean, at that base level of envy, which is so tragic that it transcends to pogroms of the Holocaust.
This is what's been interesting to me, just drawing comparison with anti-African American sentiments. When I was a kid, we were criticized for being too lazy and not working hard enough. Now, if you look at these rallies of neo-Nazis and all, they're criticizing us for working too hard, being too successful, and that they're paying some penalty for our success. So yeah, hatred is something that just carries on, one generation to the next, and we've got to constantly fight against it.
The worst kind of leadership is that plays on these grievances.
Right.
Yeah.
But these grievances, I would argue, guys, find life when people are struggling. And I think it points to an underlying base issue here, that there are a lot of people in this country, not just white Americans, poor black Americans, poor Hispanic Americans, who are struggling. And when someone easily says, well, you're struggling because of those people, it's very, very easy to buy into that type of rhetoric versus attempting to address the issues that are a result of those individuals struggling from the first place.
Jim, one of the things that's interesting here is that we talk about the Holocaust and obviously shared concern about that, but today there is continuing ethnic violence, places like Myanmar, Syria, hundreds of thousands dead, and the global community still, so long after the end of the Second World War, lacks mechanisms to be able to address those issues. I mean, why is that? Why is that?
Well, I think in some cases, you don't have the clear-cut situation that you had in the Holocaust, whereas clearly, if you overthrow the Nazis, the Jews were not going to start murdering the Germans. Whereas you have in some countries, if you intervene against a government, it will simply switch which ethnic group is slaughtering the other.
That's a good point.
Some of it has to do with intervention fatigue. We've had interventions for other purposes that did not necessarily go so well. So Western governments, despite their commitment to never again, sometimes are a bit hesitant to do that. And then there has been a persistent, I think, reluctance to get involved when it's not in Europe, when it's further removed from the West, when it's in Africa and places like that. And I think that also sort of feeds into this.
Good points. Anyone else want to jump on that issue?
People are just tired of war.
Right.
And it's not just Republicans, it's Democrats, voters writ large in this country are tired of this interventionism. Americans, I think, would argue we have enough issues in our own country, from education to transportation to health care, jobs. Why in the world is it our responsibility to be all over the world trying to police or assist every other country when there are people here who are struggling?
And
I think that's the mentality of a lot of people.
Because that's what you do if you're a superpower.
Eleanor Patel, but
Eleanor, finish.
You're not the policeman, but you are a protector, and that's the role that the superpower should play.
Well,
and I just would add to that anti-Semitism is a particular strain of hatred and grievance that does arouse people, and rightly so. And so we need this country needs to stand up.
I know we
and I'll come back.
Very, very quickly. That another problem is with our intervention is our intelligence is so bad. The Afghan papers here recently shows you once again we have gone into a country without really knowing what's going on there. For my generation, it was Vietnam, and the Pentagon papers showed how we were fighting a war against communist aggression. They were fighting a war of liberation. Two entirely different wars. And we wonder why it took over a dozen years before we finally gave up. And this is happening. How about it happened? When we went into Libya, and I can name one country after another.
Right.
Until we get better intelligence, we shouldn't try to be the world's police. We're just going to screw it up.
No, we shouldn't. And tell that to someone in Iowa or Ohio who's struggling. Tell that to a black family in Alabama or Mississippi or Georgia. tell that to a Hispanic family in Arizona or California, that we should go and deal with the ills of other people, when again there are people in our own country who are looking around and who are saying, what in the world are our leaders doing? But I can barely survive, Eleanor, but we want to help the rest of the world. It doesn't make sense.
It doesn't have to be either or. And I would argue that I don't think there are any potential conflagrations that we are contemplating getting into. So this is not really, this is moot at the moment.
And one of the challenges here is that, you know, NATO, again, is it unfair that the Europeans don't pay their fair share? Yes. And Trump, I think, is right to push them. But that alliance has preserved and allowed for the construction of a rule of law-based economies, wealth, but
That's
at the same
on a continent that used to have a war every 20 years.
Exactly. And at the same time, I think as well, we saw with Afghanistan, as much as the grievous mistakes been there, we went in there because of social conflagration that essentially exported itself towards us. So some of these, the issue here is to Eleanor's point, that the interconnectedness is something we have to be aware of. As a sort of concluding comment, Jim, what would you say is the best way to counter anti-Semitism? Is it education? Is it exposure to synagogues? What do you think?
Well, I think we're just, at this point, we're even seeing sort of changes in the character of anti-Semitism, or at least the identity of anti-Semitism, where you not only have the familiar neo-Nazi, white nationalist, alt-right type of anti-Jewish racism, but you're also seeing conflicts between Muslims and Jews. You're seeing African-American anti-Semitism, intersectionality, the Jews' role there.
Education.
So education is key.
Education.
Sunlight, the best disinfectant.
Right.